From warnings of uninhabitability to impacts on mental health to how our beer and coffee and chocolate might be affected, climate change touches every corner of the news cycle and every corner of our lives, as it should. We're increasingly aware of how important it is to take action to mitigate what we can, and the built environment is taking stock of how to address climate change and increase sustainability. I am Erin Looney from the DBIA National Headquarters, and this is the Design Build Delivers podcast, brought to you by USCAD. In this episode, Molly Jones talks about her upcoming book, Building Beautifully, and what it means in the discourse around climate change and construction, architecture, and engineering, with a focus on how the project delivery method impacts this vital issue. Molly is not only the author of Building Beautifully, she is an architect and she is an advocate. Molly has done everything from social media advocacy to TED Talks to stress the importance of sustainable building. But let's let Molly tell her story. So Molly, we've talked to you before on the Design Build Delivers podcast, but for our listeners who haven't met you yet, and for me, since I'm still calling myself new, talk to us about the path you've taken to your work today.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me again, Erin. My path started, I'm a professional architect, have been since long ago. But my architecture career kind of came to a head when I got a call that my mother was in ICU and was not sure if she was going to survive or not. And I had been kind of dabbling a little bit in sustainability up until that time, but it was really that incident with my mother that led me to kind of commit to a new trajectory in my professional career that it was really centered on sustainable design and construction. And so that incident really did kind of set me on this path to where we are today, which is a path that is that I'm calling Build Beautifully. And that path it's broader than just sustainability, right? My entry into sustainable design really was about indoor air quality. That was the issue my mother was faced with. Some poor indoor air quality really complicated her COPD and put her into an exacerbation, which is why she ended up in ICU. Then I had the opportunity to start working on design build projects as a practitioner. I very quickly saw a nexus between sustainable design and the design build project delivery method, where if we're using the design build done right best practices they didn't exist when I started, but the projects I was working on, at least some of them were using them, and I saw a real direct correlation between those best practices and the ability for design teams to bring their very best in sustainable design to the table in a way that is far more collaborative, in my opinion, than other project delivery methods. I really saw it at an early time period, I will just say, and probably about the early 2000s, early to mid 2000s, where design build could help support more sustainable projects. So that's led me to where I am today in a nutshell. So today, we function as owner advisors. And what that does is it affords us the opportunity to help guide the development of RFQs and RFPs that will help produce opportunities for design build teams to be able to bring their most innovative solutions forward in a sustainable way and create more sustainable projects, which then translates into more sustainable future for all of us.
So sustainable architecture, it's not really new. As you've already said, this has been your path for many years. We could talk about this topic at length, from Frank Lloyd Wright to Bob Berkebile, responses in the 1970s to the oil crisis, and so on and so on. The point is, many people have tackled it to some extent over the last few decades. Even recently, in fact, in the New Yorker, there was a piece about a young Swedish architect, Pavels Hedström, and his work centers on sustainability, but it's in this significantly more abstract space than your work, because your work is not abstract. It's situated in how the delivery method chosen for a project can be key to addressing climate change in the built environment. So that brings us to Building Beautifully, your upcoming book, that tackles that relationship between project delivery selection and climate change outcomes. First question, how did you come to this place? What led you to write this book and why now?
So I'm a reluctant author, but I do feel like I have a unique perspective just based on my expertise in sustainability, but also my expertise in design build, and certainly my expertise as an owner advisor in the design build world. And so really just kind of understanding that early decision about what project delivery method we use and how it supports and to what level it supports sustainable outcomes is really what really drove me to write this book. If we're watching the news at all, we know that pretty much on a daily basis, we're seeing things about articles and segments about the climate and what's happening in the climate. But we're also seeing things that are a little tertiary to that, things like war, famine, unrest, migration, that sort of thing. As I've kind of been looking at the climate science, I'm really realizing that there's a lot of climate issues that are the underlying factors or contributing factors to a lot of the things that are happening today in our world. And it just became obvious to me that now was the time that this book really needed to come out so that those of us that are in the AEC industry and owners in particular can really understand how important those early decisions are for setting their project up for success and sustainability.
Now let's talk about the title of the book. Define what you mean in this context by building beautifully.
So the whole concept of Build Beautifully is really built around three questions. And they're pretty general questions, but if you think about them, you'll come to some pretty unique answers for yourself and targeted answers. And the questions really are, why am I building? That's the first one. And the second one is, what am I building? And then the third one is, how will I choose to build? And this book is really centered on that third question about how am I choosing to build, right? So in the book, we're making some assumptions about the why am I building and what am I building, although we do kind of cover some difference between building a new building from the ground up and modifying existing vertical construction projects. Some of these strategies also apply to horizontal construction as well, especially for new construction. But that really is what it centers around, is just taking a very intentional and mindful look at those questions and answering them honestly as individuals and as groups and organizations to really understand why we're doing what we're doing and doing it in a much more intentional manner.
There's a phrase, a theme, if you will, that has been popping up everywhere lately in the industry. It was in a few of the awards submissions this year, and it was in August's podcast on VDC. It also is in your book. It's the title of a chapter. And the phrase is begin with the end in mind. So let's look at that. Let's revisit it again here and how it applies to sustainability.
Yeah, so I think one of the things we're thinking about is really like, where is the end to, right? We want to begin with the end in mind, but we have to define what the end is. And the end is not the end of a 25-year life cycle, ideally. It's more of a 50, 75, 100-year life cycle. But it's not even then. It's what happens after the building's useful life, right? How do we deconstruct or disassemble that building? And how do we deal with its components? Do we recycle them? Can we upcycle them? Can we reuse them in ways that are meaningful? So it's really thinking about beginning with the end in mind, for sure, but that end, really defining what that is and what that looks like. And then that's what feeds your goals and aspirations at the beginning of the project.
So now thinking about the different players on a design build team, what do you hope each of them, the categories, not individuals necessarily, get from your book?
So this book really is targeted at owners to help them understand, because they are the ones that are making that initial decision at the beginning of a project. But the secondary audience is also architects that usually are kind of the first at the table in a lot of projects. And so helping arm owners and architects, but mostly owners, with the information that they need to understand in a relatively unbiased way the difference between the project delivery systems, but then in a biased way, my opinions about how the design build project delivery method is very well suited for owners that are ready to make in some cases a cultural and mindset shift to be able to come over and utilize this project delivery system and use it and leverage it to get much more sustainable outcomes on their projects. So I'd say we're pretty laser focused on owners with this book because they're the ones making the decision. But because architects are the first in the room, it would be helpful for them as well in some ways.
And to some extent, it makes sense for everyone on a design build team to understand what the owners are doing when they set the standards and the expectations for the project. So while you're not saying that only owners are going to get anything out of this book, you're saying that owners are primarily the target for the book.
It's also good for design builders too, to understand like the questions that we're encouraging owners to take on as they're making that critical decision about project delivery method, because there are a lot of times where they're the first in too. So it really does kind of touch on everyone, right? But it is really centered on that owner and that owner's decision.
Gotcha. And you've mentioned this, that design build is situated for improving sustainability in a meaningful way. So let's talk about that. How is design build situated to improve sustainability?
When you're working on a sustainable project, like the big things that we really want to do is we want to get everybody at the table. We want to hear all the voices. We want to, get buy-in from everyone involved in the project. And that is inherent to the integrated nature of design build, right? Everyone's already at the table. So having those early conversations about sustainability in that context with everyone at the table and everyone having a voice and everyone being heard really just is a natural fit for sustainable outcomes. The other thing that I think is really, really important is that we really encourage innovation and creativity in the design build team. And depending on the type of design build you use, the owner is involved earlier in the actual design process, or maybe they're a little bit remote from that for a very early phase. But their involvement in it, they set the stage for it, right? So they're setting the goals, the overarching goals, and those goals are based on aspirational goals, and also some of them come out of risks. So if we've got a project that's in a sensitive area that really needs to address some resilient issues, those get identified as risks that then translate into goals. And maybe those are baseline goals for a project, but maybe they're also aspirational goals. But the thing that I think is so helpful with design build is just this real unleashing of the teams to be able to meet and support those goals and in a lot of cases aspirational goals of the project. And that is what I think is so unique to design build and is really the hallmark of why I believe that it's the best tool we have in our project delivery toolbox today to help us deliver these sustainable projects.
Are you interested in sustainable design and construction practices, but concerned about profitability? USCAD, a VinZero company, helps forward-thinking ENR top-ranked AEC firms mitigate risk and drive profit through digitalization using Autodesk AEC technology. To learn more, contact uscad.com/DBIA for a free 30-minute consultation. That's uscad.com/DBIA. You've talked a little bit about multiple voices throughout the process, and we can't help but bring ourselves and our experiences to our work. And I think you've hinted at how that is part of the value, and if the voices are being heard, then there are more perspectives to consider. That makes sense. So what about research? What does research say about design build and sustainable outcomes to support what you hear from those voices?
So first of all, I'm just going to throw it out there that we need new research. We don't have a lot of it, and what we have is old. So there were a couple of studies that I have looked at, and one of them was with the Charles Pankow Foundation and DBIA and a few other folks involved or organizations involved in it. And in that study, they really, the outcome was that more collaborative and integrative project delivery methods were seeing better outcomes from a sustainability standpoint. It was a relatively narrow study. And then the other one that I found was a study on 3 GSA courthouses. 2 were design build, another one was construction management, plus a few borrowing a few strategies from the integrated project delivery model into it. And what that study found, just very generally, was that they were seeing better outcomes from a sustainability standpoint. And in fact, the study says that the outcomes were really pointing towards the engagement of a more formal verification program after occupancy. So that first year of occupancy, which is kind of the warranty period that design builders use and contractors generally, but really looking at enhancing and shoring that period up with some additional measurement techniques and strategies to make sure that building's performing. They found very different results when they were doing that versus when they weren't. So that kind of goes back to this idea of really letting a building get burned in, right? You buy a car. I don't know if this is true for all cars. I haven't bought a car in a while, but when I bought my last car, they're like, you're going to burn this in. You're going to burn it in for 500 miles. And so you may see some quirks in the car until you get about 500 miles going. Well, buildings are no different. Buildings have many different systems. We really need to get them transitioned to stable operations, which takes a year to 18 months, if not 24 months, and really understand how these buildings are operating, and make sure that they're operating in the way that they were designed and intended to operate. So that was one of the things that GSA found in their study. And then the other one was very similar to what DBIA found, which was this design build collaborative and integrated project delivery method was really helpful in bringing about more sustainable outcomes and doing it in a way that really has everybody singing from the same hymnal, so to speak.
And have you found anything in your own research on climate change that you'd say is unexpected or particularly interesting?
So that's a really interesting question, because what I found was looking at the research on, how the global temperatures were being recorded every year. NASA had a graphic that came out that showed the world in a relative heat map year by year by year, which is a really interesting little graphic. And then the World Economic Forum also had a graphic doing the same thing. I believe the World Economic Forum went back a little further than the NASA one did. But the World Economic Forum, and they showed it differently too. They didn't show it on a map. They showed it in a circle with each of the 12 months around it. What jumped off the page at me was this heat that occurred in 1877 and 1878. Like, it jumped off the page, and I was instantly mesmerized. Like, what the heck happened back then that caused the world to be so warm for 2 years? And what I found was that there was a La Nina event that preceded it, and then it was followed by a severe El Nino effect. This severe El Nino event took a drought event that had occurred in 1876 and made it much worse. So there were basically droughts occurring across the country. There were a handful of countries that were impacted far more than others. And they call that the Great Drought. And I thought, my goodness, if that happened then, what were the outcomes of that? And what happened was there was the global famine that started in 1876, the end of 1876, and it went through 1878. Anywhere from 19 million to 50 million people lost their lives, centered in a handful of countries, but due to this naturally occurring event. And the research that was done on that, and some talks that were given after that by a researcher by the name of Depti Singh, she actually is really concerned about what could happen if these causes and conditions came about today. Then you rewind back into July and you realize this past year we moved from a La Nina into an El Nino. And so if something like that were to happen today, are we prepared as not just a country, but as a world and as humanity? And the big question in my mind is, could we see an event that is that catastrophic or even greater occurring in our modern times, that's based on a combination of naturally occurring climatic events and the man-made exacerbation of those events? And so that was really, really eye-opening to me, and frankly, kind of just underscored and that this book needed to come out and needed to tell this story, and that it was the right time.
And so your hope here related to that is that some of the concepts you put forth in the book that can help predict and prepare for something similar to that.
Yeah, just that buildings play a big role in the mitigation of climate change, right? We play a big role through energy reduction, responsible material choice, water use, but we also play a huge role with carbon reduction. And it really underscored for me that we have an opportunity here to really step into this and engage in more sustainable practices in the AEC industry and build more sustainable buildings. And that really can help move the needle, not just in one sector of the energy pie, but potentially in multiple sectors. So, and the greenhouse gas emissions will then follow that, and they'll reduce as well.
So we've been talking about the book, and it sounds really fascinating to hear this perspective, but I don't want to spoil too much of what's in it. So you don't have to give away all your secrets here. But when you picture a project that has taken into account everything you're advocating for in the book and in your work, what does that look like?
In an ideal world, it looks like a project that is restorative and regenerative, that is energy producing rather than energy consuming, that is creating all of its own water, that is carbon neutral, so it's not adding carbon to the atmosphere. And it has a healthy interior environment so people can live healthier lives. And those of us that may have compromised lung issues are actually better for being in that building than we would be otherwise. So that's what it looks like to me.
So that goes back to what you said earlier about the impact on your mom and how that sent you in this direction. Now we're going to shift a little bit here to DBIA. As you know, and many of our listeners know, and for anyone listening who does not know, visit dbia.org. DBIA has a plethora of resources for advancing design build done right. So in terms of climate change, sustainability, and building beautifully, how can DBIA and our members help?
I'm not a huge proponent of just of like cutting edge design and construction. I'm really a proponent of each project doing what it can, right? So I think if everyone listening and everyone involved in the AEC world could just do what they could, we would be in a much different position with regards to mitigation of climate change. And it wouldn't be quite such a huge issue. So where we currently are is we need to take action. We just can no longer wait. So I think if you haven't been engaged in sustainable design, you educate yourself on it and you do what you can. And those of us that have been involved in it, we keep advocating for it and keep doing as much as we can what that's feasible on these projects. And we begin to maybe ask some other questions like project life cycle. Can we move past whatever the current life cycle is, and can we push that envelope a little bit and maybe get a longer life cycle on the project and really think about how these projects and their components are used at the end of their useful life. So, and then there's also like the consideration of just asking, does it make sense to build a new building right now? Or is there an existing building who already has its embodied carbon wrapped up within the materials in that building? So you're adding much less embodied carbon to that project. Is that an option? Is there a building available that we could renovate and be able to use for the current use of the building that we're looking to build? So that's definitely a huge issue. We have a huge portfolio of existing projects in this country. Like everywhere you look around, if it's got a roof on it and people are in it, it's existing. So we can leverage those projects and really help change things, because a lot of those buildings aren't going to go away, right? So if we can repurpose them and reuse them, I think that is a really good alternative for us.
What comes to mind when you say that is sporting spaces, stadiums.
Mhm.
We have so many of them. And it seems to me a lot of times the first line of, I don't know, progress for a team, for a club or a league is let's build a new stadium. And from what you're saying, it sounds like maybe that isn't ideal in terms of sustainability and in terms of longevity of the structures. So is a new building always right in those cases?
Well, I mean, I think you definitely have to weigh everything out because there may be a new life for that facility if that team moves on. And there's always a balance that you're striking between the needs of that existing team, in this case for sporting events, and what that facility can support. But there may be other opportunities. So perhaps that facility could support other sporting events, or maybe there's a way to reimagine it to be something else and become something else, and maybe even spur on a new economic development in that area as a result. So I'm not going to say like yes or no. Yeah.
I often ask, what was wrong with the existing stadium? But let's go back a little bit here to design build teams. You talked about taking action a moment ago. So when we look at the people on design build teams, particularly owners, but not just owners, what are some small scale goals that owners and those other team members can aim for now?
So I think probably the smaller scale goals, which frankly we'll just call them low hanging fruit, right? So really is looking at your building portfolio and look at your environmental and social governance, your ESG reports or your sustainability reports, whatever it is that your organization is putting out. And likely it's both of those. And see where there is synergy between some goals that you can establish for your projects and how those can support achievement of your goals as an organization. And really, I would start there and focus on those. And then obviously, if you look at what you can do at the micro level, at the project level, within the context of that project and where it's located, to be able to look for like materials that you can procure that are nearby, that their raw materials are nearby, they can be manufactured nearby. Look at the carbon embodied materials in everything that you're doing, and certainly reducing energy. And we talk about it in the book, but reducing energy really deals with one piece of the greenhouse gas emission pie, so to speak. So it deals with a certain percentage of that pie. But when you start to like look at, and this is the larger scale goal, which is carbon reduction, because that's kind of like the elephant in every room, every sustainability room right now. But if you're looking at carbon reduction, you're actually impacting the remainder of that pie, right? So you're going beyond like the direct impact that energy efficiency can have on your building and opening that up to really impact other greenhouse gas emission sectors. So like the transportation sector and the manufacturing sector instead of just the building sector. But look at what we can do that enhances our own organization or agency or company goals that we have and that we're reporting on. And then the bigger one is how do we open that up and really deal with that elephant in the room, carbon.
And you anticipated the question. And that was exactly where we were headed. So we're going to go to a little bit different place. This is kind of a bonus question before we come back to talking about the larger community. So what have you found throughout these years of doing what you do to be the most difficult part of your work?
Yeah, I'm not sure that there's really a most difficult part. So the nice thing is I love what I do, right? So there's not really one part that's more difficult than the other. But I do think that when it comes to owners, they have full-time jobs. They're doing other things, right? So building a building is usually not their full-time job. And so what we have found is that taking some time to really educate owners on what's happening with the climate science, what's happening with sustainability, how it can impact their project and how it can improve their bottom line and their reporting is really time very well spent. So we do like to do that with our clients and talk them through so that we can really set good aspirational goals for the project from a sustainability perspective. That's honestly why we're in this business. So we are sustainability consultants turned into owner advisors. So it's not a difficult part of the business, but it is certainly, it's one that we enjoy. It's one that I think is really needed because they're likely not science geeks like we are and watching what's going on in the world. So I think that they find that helpful to know that we're kind of watching that and can help them understand and navigate what's going on.
It sounds like it's something that needs to be done and isn't always the quickest conversation, but it's necessary. I mean, to understand what you're doing really helps you more emphatically want to do it. And so what we have is, so far, we've talked a lot about the teams, the design build teams, the owners, the people who are building the buildings. But what about everyone else? Because a building doesn't just stand there and then do nothing. It impacts the community where it's located. Facilities, whatever you're building, actually is part of that community. So when we think more broadly, what can our listeners, industry professionals, or just users of facilities and buildings, what can they do to encourage a better focus on building beautifully? How can we all advocate for sustainable design in our corners of the planet?
Well, I think, again, kind of just going back to doing what we can do and looking beyond the building. I think that's really important, Erin, that you brought that up, because really our buildings, I think it was Winston Churchill that said, first we shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us. So really understanding the lasting impact that that building has once it's in the world, and how that can actually help support human health, human happiness, and mitigate climate change. Or in some cases, maybe work against those three things. And so really, this is all wrapped up in Build Beautifully. It's that real intentionality with what we do, and that mindfulness of our actions, and really taking the time to think about every decision that we make. And we spend 85% of our 100% of the pie, 85% of it goes to operations and maintenance of that building. So we're spending 15% of the entire cost of operating and maintaining that building at the front end, at the design and construction. And it warrants taking a step back and really looking at those decisions that we're making as we're designing and building these buildings. And I advocate that it takes we take a further step back and look at how we're procuring these buildings and how we're delivering them. It impacts for the rest of the life of that building. It impacts everyone around that building, the people in the building, and then, of course, what happens with the building at the end of its useful life. So I think I'm a big advocate of not taking the first step back, right, but taking the second step back. Like, we really look at how we're going to spend that 15%, how we're going to procure that building, and how we're going to set the team up for success. So it sets you up for success as an owner.
And also, you've touched on this a little bit about just kind of the heart of this question with your Winston Churchill quote, first we build our buildings and then our buildings build us. To some extent, that New Yorker article I mentioned, part of his focus is to blur the line between those spaces we build and the spaces that exist. So instead of mowing down nature for our purposes, it's more like sharing our purposes with nature and sharing nature's purposes with us, which is, I guess I'd say, possibly a little bit crunchy way of what you're saying right now. But it seems the ultimate goal, crunchy or not, is to make everything exist in harmony and do less damage. Ideally, of course, no damage, but I'd say less might be a good goal.
I think it's a do no harm. Like, it's not less harm, in my opinion. It's really, let's move towards doing no harm with our buildings and letting them live in harmony and synergy with their surroundings, whatever those surroundings may be. And let's find ways to use our incredible minds to put our buildings together in ways that really help enhance that harmony and synergy between ourselves as people, our buildings that support our activities, and then the natural surroundings that they're in.
Let's go ahead and wrap this up. We're going to end this episode with an exercise, for lack of a better way to say it. As you're walking out of a conference, let's just make it a DBIA conference, of course, and someone asks you, hey, Molly, what is Building Beautifully about? Now, You have just about the length of a soccer pitch. It's about 100 yards, give or take. Before you lose this person to their ride share, what do you tell them?
I tell them building beautifully is really about embracing the future for our children and grandchildren, and mindfully and intentionally taking action today with everything that we do to help them have the best future possible. So that took about 10 yards.
Now they have 90 plus yards to ask questions.
Yes.
And I'm sure one of those questions they would have would be, when and where can I get Building Beautifully? The answer is first quarter of 2024 and in the DBIA bookstore. We will let you know when it's ready for purchase at store.dbia.org. Thank you to Molly Jones for an enlightening preview of Building Beautifully and a great conversation about sustainability in the built environment. And thanks to our Design Build Delivers podcast sponsors, USCAD. Learn more at uscad.com/DBIA.